Welcome to another episode of How to Ride Your Motorcycle. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the front brake as well as the rear brake and when to use them, because the front brake and the rear brake is used for different purposes. Riding a motorcycle and riding a bicycle will seem a little bit similar in the sense that you have a front brake and a rear brake. Besides that, everything else is different. When you're riding a bike, using your front brakes can be very, very dangerous because the bicycle doesn't weigh much and all the weight is at the top, meaning you are most of the weight. With a motorcycle, that's different because all of the weight is underneath you. This motorcycle in particular weighs about 400 pounds, and I'm nowhere near that. With that being said, when you're riding a bicycle and you're using your front brakes, it's very, very easy to endo, especially if you're doing 20-30 miles an hour and you're going to lock up your front wheel. That means the back is going to come up and you're going to endo face plant on the floor. And that's something a lot of you guys are thinking will happen with a motorcycle. But that doesn't happen with a motorcycle. The motorcycle, on the other hand, as I mentioned before, has all the weight underneath you. When you're riding a motorcycle and you're going faster than 20 miles an hour, you should stay away from your rear brakes, and you should only use your rear brakes when you're doing less than 20 miles an hour. So as an example of how fast your motorcycle can slow down using your rear brake versus your front brake, I'm going to go about 20 miles an hour and then slam on the rear brake just so you can see how long it takes for me to slow down. Doing 20 miles an hour. Here we go. So there we go. Now look how long it took me to slow down. You see where I am right now? Let's try that once again, but with the front brake. Alright, same place. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing, 20 miles an hour, and then hit my front brakes as hard as I can without endoing. Alright, there you go. That was my front brakes. And as you can see, it took me literally 2 feet to stop versus all the way here when it came to the rear brakes. So this brings me to a logical conclusion that the front brakes offer 70% of your braking pressure, while your rear brakes offers you anywhere between 20 and 30%. But not all motorcycles are going to have the same stopping power. However, the distribution of the power will always remain the same. You have 70, you have 30. And so, as you saw, I was riding 20 miles an hour and I slammed on my front brakes and I didn't endo. The rear didn't come up, and I didn't face plant on the floor. As I mentioned before, most of the weight transfer is below you. So the chances of your motorcycle doing a stoppie, which basically means that the rear is going to come up, is very, very slim. The second point I want to make about the front brakes, and this one is very, very important. When you're using your front brakes, obviously how I use my front brakes is something that an expert or someone who's got a lot of experience would do. You won't do that in the beginning. In the beginning, it's going to take you a long time because you're going to be new to the entire system. So my suggestion is to come in a parking lot like the one I'm in right now and practice using your brakes. Now here's a very, very important tip I want to give you guys. This is something I learned very early on, and this is something that I recommend for you as well. You should always cover your brake lever with 2 fingers, okay? Not with your whole hand, but with 2 fingers. Reason number 1 is if you see a car in front of you and you need to panic brake, the couple of milliseconds that it takes for you to open up your fingers or your hand, put it on your brakes, and then pull your brake lever to slow down your bike could mean crashing into that car or getting into a huge accident. So by always keeping 2 fingers on your brake lever, it saves you a couple of milliseconds from having to do it and thinking about the process before an accident actually happens. So with that being said, we're going to go 20 miles an hour like before, and I'm going to stop over there, and in the beginning this is what it's going to look like when you start as well. 20 miles an hour, hit the brakes, but slowly and gradually come to a stop while holding your clutch in. Alright, so this time I'm going to do 30 miles an hour and do the exact same thing, but I'm going to be fairly aggressive with the brakes to see how much distance I carry as I use my brakes at 30 miles an hour to come to a dead stop. There we go. Let's check it out. Alright, so that was 30 miles an hour. I applied my brakes around this point here, and this is how long it took for me to get there. If we can use steps as feet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it took me about 9 steps. So if you want to make that your goal, of stopping that quickly from 30 miles an hour to 0 in this amount of space, and I guess that's a pretty good indication of using your front brakes properly. And as I mentioned before, I didn't use my rear brakes, but I used the front. And previously I showed you how slamming my rear brakes caused me to go even further out, because the rear brakes only give you about 30% pressure versus the front, which gives you 70% of the pressure. And each time I used my front brakes, the rear didn't come up, I didn't endo or anything like that. So as I mentioned before, riding a bicycle versus riding a motorcycle is completely different. Alright, so now that we got the front brake out of the way, let's talk about the rear brakes. Me personally, I don't really use my front brake and my rear brake simultaneously, but it's something that you can do. However, I use my rear brakes when I'm in traffic lights, in situations where I'm doing less than 20 miles an hour. In the beginning, when you're riding a motorcycle for the first time, using your rear brakes is something that I highly recommend, because if your wheel is turned just slightly like that, and you use your brakes and you give it a lot of pressure like I did a lot, what's going to happen is that you're going to low side. Your bike is going to fall. So using your rear brakes, regardless if you're turning or not, will not make your motorcycle low side. As you can see, I'm not low siding. The bike is not falling. I'm going to come to a slow stop, even while I'm turning. You see that? However, if you do that and you're a new motorcyclist, you might panic brake and you might drop your motorcycle, because all the weight is going to transfer to the front wheel and it's going to cause your motorcycle to crash. So be very, very careful about using your front brakes while your wheel is turned. Now I know some of you guys that are watching this are probably already experienced and you're watching this just to learn a couple of more tips and tricks. So you might comment down below, well, what about trail braking? Well, yes, you can use your front brakes while you're trail braking. However, that's a completely different subject. This video is for brand new riders who know nothing about the front or the rear brakes and just want to know at which times what brake is more appropriate to use. To answer that and to sum everything up, the front brake is appropriate to use anytime you're above 20 miles an hour. The rear brake is appropriate to use anytime you're below 20 miles an hour. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go on the road and I'm going to demonstrate for you in a real world scenario how you can do that. Alright, so now using my rear brakes, because I'm only doing 20 miles an hour, 15 or whatever it was. There you go, you see? Here goes the traffic light, perfect example. I'm using my front brakes. Now I'm going to switch over to using my rear brakes. Look at that. Coming to a stop at a stop sign. Using my front brakes. Now I'm going to switch over to my rear, holding my clutch and coasting, and then putting my hand on the front brakes and slowing myself down gently while I hold the clutch down.
A few moments later.
To summarize, motorcycles and bicycles are completely different. With a bicycle, you will never, ever use 70% front brake pressure to stop, because if you do, your bicycle is going to endo, because all of the weight is at the top. However, for a motorcycle, all the weight is on the bottom. So you want to use your front brakes when you're over 20 miles an hour only, okay? Now, as far as your rear brakes are concerned, your rear brakes have 30% of the braking pressure, and you're only going to use your rear brakes when you're under 20 miles an hour. As a beginner rider, if your wheel is turned a little bit and you're using your front brakes, and you're going to do a lot of panic braking when you're just a beginner, because you're unsure about what's going to happen next, so you panic brake to protect yourself and your bike. However, you're going to cause more harm if your wheel is just a little bit over to the left or to the right. What's going to happen is that all the weight is going to transfer to the front and your bike is going to low side and you're going to fall down. So that's why it's very, very important as a beginner to use your rear brakes. Other than that, rear brakes should be used at traffic lights because it helps you slow down gradually. Besides that, the other suggestion I have for you is find a huge parking lot and practice doing emergency stops. Do 20-mile-an-hour stops, do 30-mile-an-hour stops. I wouldn't do more than that in a parking lot. I don't think it's really that effective going faster than that as a beginner rider, but 20 to 30 miles an hour, and measure the distance it takes for you to stop. So if you can, get a couple of cones or use something like I did, but that's really entirely up to you. It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. As long as you have a reference point, it doesn't matter if you use cones or not. The next video that's going to be coming up is how to take your motorcycle on the highway. And then there's also going to be another video about lane splitting because here in California it's legal. And with that being said, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode. Peace!